Hi everybody, Lynn Burkhead of MajorLeagueFishing.com, another edition of Burkhead's Bullpen, and we're with Brandon Palaniuk today. And Brandon, we did another interview with you once upon a time where I called you the prodigy, the natural, but really I think your real nickname ought to be Dr. Swimbait. You are the guru when it comes to swim baits. There's a lot of guys that fish swim baits. You have almost a healthy obsession with them.
Yeah. Healthy or unhealthy, that could be a matter of opinion, but definitely somewhat of an obsession with throwing just larger than average baits.
Yeah, we're not talking about swim baits in a package here that you go buy off the shelf at your local box store, the little swim baits. We're talking big custom swim baits. How did you get into fishing swim baits being from Idaho?
We talked about it. We've got a really healthy trout population up there, and anytime you've got a body of water that's got big natural bait fish like that, natural forage, those bass are used to eating that big type of bait fish, and especially a trout. A trout is very soft, it's easy for a bass to digest and eat, and it's really high in protein, and they know that. So there were some local guys at home that kind of when the big swim bait movement started happening, they started designing their own baits, and those guys really got me started, got me clued in on, kind of how to fish the baits a little bit and what they were capable of. And then that just sparked my interest enough that when I had those baits, I started throwing them more and more, and really started taking them kind of out of the West Coast and started playing with them a little bit more all across the country. And from there, it grew bigger and bigger. And, along with the more my interest grew, the bigger the baits got. Right, so now I'm throwing 12, 13-inch baits. They weigh 11, 12 ounces. You're almost throwing a saltwater rod. But the things that you see with those big swim baits, you don't see with any other bait.
Speaking of that and how big they can be, one of the things sometimes that people will ask is the swim bait's almost as big as the bass that's attacking it. Why does a bass attack something that maybe it really can't even swallow?
It's a really hard question to answer because I don't know that we fully understand what they're thinking. And that goes with any bait that you're throwing. But I think because they're such opportunistic feeders and it sparks so much curiosity that when they see that, they're just hardwired to try to take advantage of that opportunity. So when you present that opportunity at the right angle, the right bait, it triggers a sensory in their brain that a lot of other baits won't trigger. If you're just throwing a plastic worm or a crankbait, a spinnerbait, it doesn't have the same effect on those fish. And I think a lot of it has to do with the size. That big size, they know that they're going to get the most bang for their buck, and so it triggers that sensory mode of, hey, I can take advantage of this slow-moving fish. It's going to be really easy to eat, a lot easier to eat than a whole school of shad that's swimming around 100 miles an hour.
Now, your swim bait collection has become quite extensive over the years. I wish we had asked you to bring some of those in. I'm not sure we would have had enough room to display them all. What's the biggest swim bait that you've got in your collection?
I've got one it's about 12 inches long. It's a Roman-made mother, and I think it weighs 10 or 11 ounces. I can't remember. But it's hand carved out of wood, hand weighted. It's all custom made. They're not cheap. I've spent a few bucks on swim baits, but for me, it's well worth it. It's as much a hobby and a passion as it is kind of a tool for me in fishing.
Now, you can spend as much on a custom swim bait as you do a high-end rod and or reel. They are made out of a couple of different materials, at least wood, but then there's also synthetic materials that are more plastic-oriented or silicone-oriented. Which one, do you find that one typically produces more results than the other, depending on where you're at?
There's definitely different styles of swim baits. There's glide baits, or I call them two-piece baits, and that's going to have kind of a big wide S-swimming action. And those baits are made out of a lot of different materials. Wood, some of them are made out of plastic, high-density plastic, and there's a lot that are actually made out of like a dual-density resin, and they all swim a little bit different, but a lot of it has to do with more than just what it's made out of. I mean, it has to do with the weighting, the joints of it, the actual physical design of the bait, how tall it is or how wide it is. I mean, all those little things change how that swim bait swims. And then you've got multi-jointed baits, you know, that may have 3 or 4 joints. And then you've got soft plastic ones, you know, that maybe like a Huddleston, an 8-inch Huddleston that's just made out of a plastic that's got a foam harness and a internal weight system and a jig hook out of the top. And those are going to be more of your kind of finesse, more subtle type presentations. You know, and they've all got their time and place, just like you would, you know, throw a spinnerbait in one place or a crankbait in one place. All these swim baits have different actions. You can fish them at different speeds, and they're all going to trigger fish differently depending on the conditions and the body of water that you're on.
You know, because so many of them are custom made, I would think I would know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you tweak the baits at all when you get them, or do you avoid doing that for fear of changing action characteristics?
There's certain baits that you'll change, sometimes just to better your hookup ratio. And usually you don't have to change a whole lot on them. Usually it's just swapping out hooks maybe. A lot of times on some of the big glide baits, I'll actually add eyes to it because most of the fish, they want to eat a bait head first. And so a lot of times people think that they're going to try to eat a bait tail first, but what happens is those bass over time, they've learned that if they can get up behind it without that fish knowing, and they can sneak up and eat it head first, that allows them to be able to reposition that fish in their mouth without that fish being able to swim out. So they can open their mouth, and the only direction that bait fish can go is further into their mouth. They can't swim out backwards. So if they eat it tail first, they open their mouth, that fish swims out, and then all that work they put in goes to waste. So they try to eat it head first. Well, they know that the eyeballs create strike points. And so I'll add eyeballs around my hooks a lot of times to create those strike points at the hooks, just to help increase the hookup ratio.
You mentioned sometimes almost saltwater equipment to throw them. What rod, reel, line setup do you know, I know it's probably going to change depending on how big the bait is, but is there a general ballpark you're getting in?
I like a 7-9 to 8 foot heavy action rod. The one I throw a lot is a 7-11. It's an Abu Garcia Fantasista outsider rod, and it's got a fairly light tip. I mean, for a swim bait rod, you know, it's not a light tip. You're not going to throw a drop shot or something on it. But as far as the whole rod goes, it's got a good tip, but a really good backbone so that you can launch those baits. But that lighter tip allows you to really control the bait, especially on a big glide bait or something. You can really feel what the bait is doing. And I'm going to throw it, you know, I'd say most of my baits I throw on 20-pound Berkeley Trilene 100% fluorocarbon. When I start getting into those big 10, 11, 12-inch baits, you know, the real heavy ones, I will switch to like a 25 or a 30-pound Trilene big game, the mono. Just that little bit of stretch does a couple things. It helps if you get a backlash that you're probably not going to break off a $500 swim bait. It's going to take a little bit of that shock, but it also absorbs the shock when you set the hook on those fish. And so there's different scenarios for different things. As far as a reel goes, most of the time I throw an Abu Garcia Revo Beast. And it's got big handles so that when you hook those fish, you can grind them into the boat. I mean, because you're throwing big baits and you're fishing for big fish. And so either that or they've got a new one. It's a new Toro Beast, and it's just a bigger spool because you've got big line and big baits, and you want to be able to get those big fish in the boat.
Where are you going to look to throw these baits at? What type of structure, what type of cover?
A lot of that depends on the body of water you're on, water clarity, and kind of a lot depends on the forage that you're fishing for. Kind of the key things is just you got to look for ambush points. And what I mean by that is that can be a long extending point that's got a real steep drop, because those fish will like to sit off that drop, and as the bait fish come over, they like to come up and ambush. And another good thing is, you know, bluff walls. they'll get on bluff walls, those big fish. They like to be able to move up and down in that water column and have close access to deep water. That's a big thing when you're, I guess, hunting these big fish. And another one of my favorites is docks. You know, I catch a lot of really big fish off docks that sit out over deep water. They can suspend underneath those docks, especially in the springtime. As those fish are starting to move back into spawn, you'll get them where they'll position up on those docks really well.
A couple of last things you've mentioned a couple of times. It's a big fish bait.
Yep.
You do tend to catch some pretty good sized fish, maybe the best fish of an event or
Yep.
best fish of an outing. How big are we talking? Are we talking true blue trophies?
The biggest bass I've ever caught, my personal best.
Down in Texas, right?
Yeah, I caught it on an 8-inch Huddleston this year, and that was a 12.4, and that's the biggest one I've ever caught. Before that, my biggest bass was on a Swimbaits. So for me, I mean, it's a way that you're going to catch a fish of a lifetime. But it's starting to evolve into, you know, there's more baits that you're able to kind of fish in tournaments a lot. You know, I mean, obviously I'm not going to throw a lot of the 10 and 12-inch baits in a tournament situation. But those 7, those 8-inch baits, you go to a place like Gunnersville, Toledo Bend, Lake Fork, you know, places that have a good population of 4+ pound bass. They can really come into play in those tournament situations.
And I guess the last question I had is, can you think of a time where it was a game changer for you in a tournament setting?
There's been a lot of times that it's played a huge role for me. Not necessarily, I haven't had a tournament where that's just all I strictly threw, but specifically a year ago or 2 years ago at Table Rock Lake, we had a tournament there. It was early spring, and I came up, I formulated this game plan where I could go run up the rivers, I could catch a good limit, throwing a jerkbait and throwing a wiggle wart, and then I would give myself 3 hours to go throw a swimbait. I said, I'm going to throw a swimbait for 3 hours at the end of the day down in the lower part of the lake where it's a little bit cleaner, and if I can get one bite, that kind of would catapult me from that 13 to 14 pounds to, you know, 16 or 17 and give me a shot to win. And the first day, game plan went, I mean, 100% perfect. Ran up the river, caught 13 pounds, I think, on a jerkbait, and I ran back down, and I had this one kind of big, long tree. It extended out over 20 foot of water, huge laydown, and I'd seen a big fish in practice, followed my jerkbait out. And, you know, I figured it was around 5.5 pounds, and I threw my jerkbait over that tree 5 times. I made 5 casts over it, nothing. And I actually told my marshal in the boat, I said, I'm going to pull this swimbait out, and I said, we're either going to see that fish or I'm going to catch that fish if it's in that tree. And I had him come up on the front deck, and I launched a swimbait out there. And you could see probably 15 or 16 foot, so it was real clear. And I was showing my guy how the bait worked. I'm throwing a big glide bait, and it's gliding back and forth. And I told him, I said, watch, I can make this bait twitch and spin around. And I spun that bait around, and you watched that fish come up out of that tree. And I twitched it 2 more times, and she ate it, and I grind her in the boat flip it, and it's a 6.5 pounder. And that put me in the top 12 for the tournament, and it kind of set the pace for the whole rest of that week. And so, you know, I would kind of go do that every day and try to catch a 4 to 6 pounder to really make a difference.
Well, you talk about throwing around a tree. I did think of one last follow-up. I got to ask you this.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a bait that you've gotten hung up that you went in after?
Yeah, I'm not afraid to dive in after a $200 or $300
I
swim
didn't
bait.
figure you were.
No.
Brandon Palaniuk, he is the swim bait doctor on the Bassmaster Elite Series Tour and here at Major League Fishing. If you'd like to learn more about how Brandon and our other anglers fish, you can go to majorleaguefishing.com.